Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of today's show, we transition to the world of the NBA. Another huge Western Showdown conference takes place tonight between two teams that I find really similar, but have had very, very different seasons. But ultimately, it's been down to one team being more maddeningly inconsistent than the other, rather than anything to do with their overall style of play. Let me tell you the story of this Wolves-Grizzlies game tonight and how important it can be for both teams. Let's talk about the Timberwolves first, because I feel like this team throughout the season has been more defined about what they did in the offseason than what they're doing now. Obviously, they trade away Cat to the Knicks, get Randall and DiVincenzo in return, and ultimately, yes, while it's a trade that could have worked out for both sides, the Knicks look just fine with Cat, and the Timberwolves have looked like shades of the team they were last season when they made it to their conference finals, but have been too inconsistent to make any ground in the loaded Western Conference. And this is not an indictment of them at all, but it's just the nature of how this conference has evolved these past 5 or so years. On the Grizzlies side of things, they've had their off-field issues as well, Ja Morant notwithstanding. But this is a team that I really think has the mettle to be one of the most intriguing come postseason time. They have one of the most electrifying offenses in the entire NBA, and when they get going, they're going to be a really tough team to beat, especially in transition as well. So this is why tonight's game between these two is so intriguing. You have the storylines of these two young stars trying to break through in this conference, but you also have the storylines of how differently their seasons are going. And so that's why, when I talk about games like this, they all seem to be happening in the Western Conference, and they all seem to be surrounding some young star. But I don't necessarily think this game for either team will come down to their young stars. It's going to come down to how the overall team plays. If I think with the overall team, the Grizzlies have the ball in their court. They're the better team. They're the deeper team, in my opinion, and they just have more ways to attack you. Whereas the Timberwolves can attack you better than anyone in the league, similarly to what the Memphis Grizzlies do, but haven't put it all together, whether it be because of injuries, whether it be because of inconsistencies. And so that's why this game stands out to me. Let's talk about the outlook of tonight's game and what both teams need to do. So, as far as we know, for the Timberwolves side of things, Gobert and Donte DiVincenzo are game-time decisions. That's very intriguing because both of them help this team out in many different ways. Gobert being the focal point down low on both ends of the floor. Donte DiVincenzo could be a floor spacer for you. So it's going to be interesting to see, should both of them be out, how this impacts them on both the glass and on the perimeter. Then, obviously, for Memphis, Marcus Smart is out. Always been one kind of player, whether it be with Boston up to now, who has dealt with injury, and then Ja is a game-time decision, but I do think he will ultimately play because he's Ja Morant, and why not? But looking at how those injuries could impact the game, if I'm Memphis, I don't think a lot changes just because Ja Morant is out. You could still be this team who's potent in transition, who's potent down low. A lot more of your offense will ultimately have to go through Jaren Jackson, but he'll be fine with that. He likes driving to the rim as well. But if you're Minnesota and both Gobert and DiVincenzo are out, that eliminates a lot of your game plan. That really narrows how you approach this one because, like I said, Memphis's game plan is simple. Beat you in transition, beat you on the perimeter, and ultimately put up more points than you. Because that's what happened last week when these two teams met. The Wolves and Grizzlies last week played a classic, but the Grizzlies just outscored the Wolves in the end. They won 127-125, and that could very well be what we're looking at in this one. A game where the highest score ultimately wins the game. The team that can continuously put points on the board wins this one. So if I'm Memphis, I still feel good about that. If I'm Minnesota, not so much. Because you're going to just have to, if you're the Timberwolves, do things that Memphis are better than you, better than them. And that's an impossibility no matter what. Because the Memphis Grizzlies are a team that can score in the high 120s, maybe even the 130s. And Minnesota are capable of that, but they just need everything to click. So here's the way, in my opinion, that everything could click, but ultimately might fall up short for Minnesota. You're going to have to crash the glass if you're Minnesota. And that's easier said than done against Jaren Jackson, who is fantastic on both ends of the floor, one of the Timberwolves' leading scorers, but also one of the best defensive players in terms of reading the game and ultimately winning on the glass as well. So if I'm Minnesota and if Gobert's out, you're going to need guys like McDaniels, Reed, crashing the glass, whatever you do. As Anthony Manzano said, is Memphis a good defensive team, or are they just one-dimensional? Now, I haven't necessarily watched much of Memphis to really say that they're, say, a good defense, but one thing they do well to compensate for any deficiencies is play offense. And potentially you could say that their best defense is their offense. Much like I pointed out their previous matchup last week, I do feel like the main problem if you're an opponent for Memphis is how you slow them down. But I do feel that you're right in saying that at some point a team can take advantage of Memphis's lapses defensively. Say in OKC, say in the finals a team like Cleveland if they even get there. But for the most part, I'm kind of answering your question with my own kind of question here by saying, is Memphis' offense good enough to compensate for this defense? I don't know. But for games like this, where the other team is battling injury questions and they haven't been that consistent offensively, even though we know they can be, they should be just fine. The bigger questions will end up coming come postseason. But it's an interesting debate here because Memphis defensively aren't as elite as, say, the Rockets or the Thunder. And they're going to have to take them down in order to get to where they want to be. So it's an interesting question, but I don't necessarily know if it can be answered with the immediacy you might like. Let me just put it that way. But thank you for it because it brings up the point of how can this Memphis team evolve into something better than just an electrifying offense. As he also said, I agree with you, no matter how great your offense is, you can't defend anybody. A 30, 40, maybe even 50-point lead doesn't matter. And that could be the difference between them. But in this game, I ultimately think the Grizzlies have the ball in their court. But if I am Minnesota, and if I put together a consistent game, maybe Anthony's point comes to fruition here. Because if, say, Gobert plays, that gives you someone on both ends of the glass who can help in the rebounding department. Then in terms of, say, perimeter play, which I don't necessarily think Minnesota will want to lean into because they have so many elite drivers to the basket like Edwards, like Gobert. But if Dante's healthy, that gives you the three-point shot, that gives you the floor spacing you need to stretch this Memphis team. And Shaw's not necessarily the best defender in space. I feel like Dante being healthy would be a huge boon to this team. But then, ultimately, you also have to be confident in a player like Anthony Edwards if you are the Timberwolves, because he ultimately carries the destiny of this team on his shoulders. Because if he's on his game, he's a player who can take over no matter what. As Anthony says, if they're a young point guard that's on the bench of one of these playoff teams that's not getting enough playoff time that Miami can trade for to pair up with Hero in the backcourt, I'm not necessarily certain. I haven't necessarily followed the ramifications of what could happen should, the Butler drama go down. But I don't necessarily know. That's an interesting question, though. There could be a couple players, but I'm not certain that teams like OKC or Cleveland will want to trade them away, just because a lot of these top teams are starting to rely on their depth a little bit more. Like, OKC does rely on a guy like Isaiah Joe more than you think. If you look at Boston, Pritchard's become a big part of what they're doing as well. So it's an interesting debate here, but one that's, I feel, can only get answered after the whole Butler saga plays out. Because if you're looking for a nice depth piece, it might come from a team, say, like Dallas or Orlando, rather than, as he also mentions, Topic, who I believe, is Topic already on the Heat? Let me look this up. Is Nikola Topic already on the Heat? I do think that he would be, okay, he is on the Thunder. I completely forgot about Nikola Topic for a second, as he is someone who could potentially be there, but then again, if, like I'm saying, development in this league does matter, and so I'm not certain the Thunder, who, yes, have an elite point guard, would want to give up someone who they view as a project. I feel like their team really looking to really cement their core and ensure that no matter what lineup they put out there, they can put up effective minutes. Maybe Topic isn't part of their plan, but ultimately, this is a question that I think is interesting, but not one I can immediately answer just due to the tenuous situation of Miami and how these teams use their depth at the top of their respective conferences. But my last thoughts here before we leave ultimately on the Wolves-Grizzlies matchup is that the Wolves really just want to find consistency. They want to find a win that really cements their status as a top contender in the West. And ultimately, if they win tonight, they're only 4 games behind Memphis in the loss column, but they're headed into a brutal stretch. They then have to play Dallas and Denver, and who knows what will happen in those games. So the Wolves need to set a good foundation here tonight, win or lose, that proves that they can find some level of consistency. But let me know what you think of this game in the comments. Thank you for your comments as well, Anthony. Continue them coming to any of you watching through the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features next time on the show. But that will just about do it. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As always, I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. I am out for today.